Compelled by great compassion, you taught the sacred Dharma. To dispel all wrong views, to you, the Buddha Gautama, I pay homage. Do not commit any unwholesome actions. Engage in perfect wholesome actions. Subdue your mind thoroughly. This is the teaching of the Buddha. Om Sahaji Bhagi Chukching Meto Dram Re Rabling Chi Ni De Kin Padi Sangye Shindu Mekte Po Wa Ye Dro Kyun Nam Dak Shin La Shu Par Shuk. This ground anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, the four continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha land and offer it. May all transmigratory beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandala Kamnaya Dayami.
Just a refuge and bodhicitta prayer. Yeah, so again, whatever your understanding of the mind of refuge is, then generate the mind of refuge and the Buddha Dharma Sangha. And also the attitude of bodhicitta, whatever your understanding of bodhicitta or compassion for all sentient beings is, then try to generate a positive motivation based on compassion or bodhicitta. I take refuge until I am enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. Amid the collections of listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha to benefit transmigratory beings. I take refuge until I am enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. Amid two collections of explaining the Dharma, may I become a Buddha to benefit transmigratory beings. I take refuge until I am enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my two collections from explaining the Dharma, may I become a Buddha to benefit transmigratory beings. Okay, so today, what do we look at first? Actually, I want to share first, not this one. Look at some verses from the Dhammapada about refuge, which are here. So first we'll look at the verses, and then we'll look at the origin story of these, the sutra that they come from. Yeah, this ties in. Yesterday we were talking about this ties in nicely. I think different things we go for refuge to, and maybe we didn't speak about yesterday is that. Maybe before I share this, just speak about that first. Remember when we did that meditation yesterday? We first were just looking at things in ordinary, like daily life, kind of, more superficial things we go for refuge to, like when we're hungry to food, when we're cold to warmth, and so forth. It's quite easy to see how those things aren't sources of lasting happiness. They just last a short time. All the pleasures of the senses, the five sense doors, they just last a short time, and we don't have much control over them. And they're fundamentally actually in the nature of dissatisfaction. They're in the nature of the suffering of change. Basically, here. Well, let's look at the Dhammapada first. Then maybe then I'll speak a little bit. This verse from the Dharmapada first. What does it say here? So this is the Buddha saying, speaking to a Hindu teacher who he's about to convert to Buddhist, to Buddhism. So he says, many people shaken by fear go for refuge to woods and mountains, to tree shrines and pleasure parks. That is not a secure refuge. That is not the refuge supreme. That is not the refuge to come that liberates from all suffering. Whoever has gone for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, and who sees with the right wisdom the Four Noble Truths, suffering, arising of suffering, the overcoming of suffering, or the cessation of suffering, is listing the Four Noble Truths there now. The source of suffering, the origin of suffering, or the arising of suffering, the overcoming of suffering, or the cessation of suffering, and then the path, the Eightfold Noble Path leading to the stilling of suffering. That is a secure refuge. That is a refuge supreme. That is a refuge to come to that liberates from all suffering. So there the Buddha is making like a comparison, basically between things which are like temporary, adventitious refuges, but are not the supreme refuge because they don't lead to lasting resolution of suffering or elimination of suffering. So like that, we can see in our own experience, like when we're looking at, we're looking at it a little bit from a different angle yesterday, but looking at things that we just go to ordinarily in our daily lives, even things, like I was saying, pleasures of the five senses, but also things like money. Like money is a big one we turn to for the resolution of to reduce, eliminate suffering, and to some degree, of course, it has an effect, right? If we have very, very little money, then we have a lot more worry and fear. We're a lot more susceptible to, if we suddenly get an illness, then how do we pay for the treatment? Or we suddenly lose our car, or lose our home, then what do we do? Then life becomes much more difficult for those and those who depend upon us, or even those we depend upon, right? So definitely having some degree of money or kind of material possessions for an ordinary person, it helps a lot to reduce some suffering. But then, beyond a certain point, like some studies show, like beyond, say, an income of like $70,000 a year, like it doesn't really improve your quality of life that much. No, there's studies of people, at different income levels, because we tend to think, well, the more money you have, the happier you are. But at some point, it becomes like a burden just to take care of all that money. And deal with it. And you can't, you can only eat so much food, only live in so many houses, only drive like, a car so much. Anyway, so like money, wealth, power, fame, and then all the objects of the senses, eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and body, they can only bring kind of limited pleasure. And even the pleasure they do bring, it's not lasting, right? Especially when we think about death, because we're going to die eventually and be separated from all those things. No matter how much money we have, no matter how much kind of hedonistic pleasure we have, no matter how popular we are, how famous or powerful, we'll be separated from all that at death, if not before. So those things are not stable. They're not stable sources of happiness, and they're not stable like protection from suffering, right? Suffering is going to come despite those. Despite, whatever of those we have, we'll experience aging, we'll experience sickness, we'll experience death, and then within that we'll experience being meeting with things we don't want to meet with, being separated from things we don't want to be separated from, and so forth. So, and then in the larger picture, then we'll take rebirth again after death. No matter how successful we are acquiring any of those kind of sources of well-being, then not only will we be separated from them eventually, but they can't protect us dying and then taking rebirth again and again. So so in that way, especially like, then none of those things are actually a reliable refuge. So that's what the Buddha is saying here. They're not a secure refuge. Yeah, many people shaken by fear go for refuge to the woods and mountains. And there we can also insert, money, fame, power, sense pleasures, and so forth, to tree shrines in pleasure parks. That's more like a Hindu thing. You see in Hindu kind of practice, and not only Hindu, kind of across Asia, it's quite common to go for to supplicate kind of local spirits. That's what I was talking about. Tree shrines means it's more like kind of spirits or kind of deities that abide in trees or lakes or mountains or different places. And in this story, you'll see how it fits into this sutra. So all these temporary things. Many people shaken by fear go for refuge to these temporary things. That is not a secure refuge. That is not a refuge supreme. So he's saying that's not a secure refuge, right? It's not a stable source of protection. That's not a refuge. And why is it not? Because it's not a refuge that a refuge to come to or to go to that liberates from all suffering. Because that kind of refuge doesn't liberate from all suffering. So all suffering meaning including especially like the suffering of death and then rebirth again and again and again, right? The continuity of rebirth through the force of karma and afflictive emotions, which inevitably ends in death. And then as long as we still have the causes for rebirth in our continuum, afflictive emotions and karma, then we take rebirth again and again. And so that cycle is samsara. So he's saying none of those things you go to, including, and here you could also, the Buddha would also include, because here actually he's speaking to a Hindu practitioner. He would include like gods who are, I think you say gods, like worldly gods, which means gods who themselves are powerful kind of deities, you can think, who themselves are still subject to birth and death through the force of afflictive emotions and karma, because they haven't developed the wisdom, especially, that uproots samsara from the root. So from the Buddhist point of view, that would include like Brahma, Ishvara, world. Probably because Christianity wasn't a thing in Buddha's time, and Buddha doesn't seem to have met Judaism at all. But probably also, sometimes I wonder about this, but probably also what the Christian God, or the Islam God. Of course, they would consider heretical that I'm saying that, but so I don't know if this should be published on YouTube, but probably, you wonder what is the God, because there definitely is the Christian God, the God, supplicated in Judaism, Islam, and it seems to have some efficacy. There does seem to be some benefit for people there. You think, is that just a psychological thing, or is there actually some entity that they're relating to that does help in some way? I don't know. But if so, then, well, anyway, it's hard to say what that is. It's quite beyond our purview. But you see the way Buddha speaks about what are considered all-powerful gods in the Hindu pantheon of deities, then he talks about them as if, and in Buddhist sutras, they appear in ways themselves kind of saying that, basically, that they're not free from samsara. They haven't achieved a state of arhatship, or freedom from samsara. So that's why, from the Buddhist view, even other gods that are worshipped generally in other religions are for the most part considered also not stable source of refuge, because they themselves aren't liberated from suffering or from samsara, and therefore they can't show others how to be free from samsara, because they themselves haven't realized that path or that state. Yeah. So that's what he's saying here. That is not a secure refuge. That is not a refuge supreme. That is not a refuge to come that liberates from all suffering. Whoever has gone for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, and who sees with the right wisdom the Four Noble Truths. So there he's also pointing out that, the actual thing the way you're protected from suffering is actually to generate wisdom, right? And this is something we'll come to I'll speak more a bit about later, that within the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, actually the Dharma is what actually protects us most directly, is generating, and here the Buddha is saying that, generating our own understanding of and then realization of the Four Noble Truths is what actually protects our minds. The Buddha is a refuge in that he teaches those. The Sangha is a refuge in that it helps us to understand and to practice what the Buddha taught. But the actual thing that protects our minds and protects our continuum from life to life is our understanding and practice of the Buddha's teachings, the Dharma. Whoever has gone for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, and who sees with right wisdom the Four Noble Truths, suffering, arising of suffering, and the overcoming of suffering, and the path, the Eightfold Noble Path that leads to the stilling of suffering. That is a secure refuge. That is a refuge supreme. That is the refuge to come that liberates from all suffering. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Would you like to see that sutra? Why don't we look? It's a bit long. It'll take a bit of time, but one thing I wanted to also, by showing some of the sutras, because one thing I think is to encourage you to read sutras. No? It's so much of like most of the sessions we do here. I think, I'm not sure, we read the Heart Sutra occasionally, but like other sutras, especially in the Tibetan tradition, there's a lot of, and especially I was thinking as we present Buddhism, like in the West at a center like this, like we do a lot of presentation of kind of key essential messages of Buddhism as they can relate to our personal like practice, is like distilled, and kind of presented. But we don't look at the actual word of the Buddha that much, no, which is a bit missing, no, in Buddhism in the West and in the Tibetan tradition too. So sometimes I think it's really helpful, especially in the context of thinking about refuge, to really have part of going for refuge to the Buddha is to have a sense of who this person is as a person, right? And just reading, you'll see the difference between reading like the verse I just showed you from the Dharmapada. Like, yeah, the essential message is there, but you don't get really a sense of the person and the time he lived and the people he was dealing with and what he was doing as a teacher, right? Whereas you look at a sutra like this, so now I've just convinced myself to read it to you, then you really get a sense of like much more colorful sense of who the Buddha was and what he was doing and how, what he had realized and how he taught and how he guided people. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So sutra, I know it's because in Buddhism we just assume, sutra means something taught by the Buddha, right? But actually the word is used in a larger scope in Hindi, I think, and in India.
I mean, in Hinduism, there is the notion of a sutra, but it's also called like shloka. Asha will also know, but it's usually like Sanskrit verses, like mantras use. But then they also have stories of wisdom and compassion and kindness that they interleave with, like you said, a lot of wise beings, hermits, gods, and talk about that. But here,
it's a kind of spiritual context.
Yeah,
right?
It has a lot of spiritual context, right? And then you interleave it with like the Bhagavad Gita, which has a lot of verses, very similar verses to a lot of to the way of life, like the Four Noble Truths as well. So I'm wondering, when you show me a sutra, this looks like a story, but I might be wrong.
It is. Well, in the Buddhist context, a sutra is there's sutras. The first division is the sutras and commentaries.
I see.
And where, I'm trying to think. The Tibetan is do, for sutra is do, and the commentaries are shastras, but that's Sanskrit now. In Tibetan is denjo, denjo. But in the Buddhist context, then sutras has the implication that it's something either directly spoken by the Buddha or something spoken by someone else that was inspired by the Buddha. Inspired meaning the Buddha was directly present and was actually kind of making the thoughts of giving rise to that speech arise in their mind or something. There's actually 12 different ways that sutras can be spoken.
I see.
But it's all considered the word of the Buddha, as opposed to like commentaries are things written by others. Usually
interpretations? Are they interpretations of the Buddha?
Yeah, you can say they're interpretations of some of the Buddhist teachings, either commenting directly on a sutra or extracting some of the essential things and then presenting that, like the Bodhisattva's Way of Life by Shantideva.
How do we know that it is not misinterpreted? Or
Well, that's a big question. Yeah,
yes.
but that's one thing. I mean, especially the founder of this school of Tibetan Buddhism, he spent a lot of time because he felt like Lama Tsongkhapa, who's pictured, I don't know, was. Oh yeah, well, all those pictures on that wall, yeah, that's all. The Lama Tsongkhapa's at the center of all of those. Yeah, that's his life story, kind of depicted. But he spent a lot of time doing that because he felt like, in the Tibetan tradition, a lot of misinterpretations of the Buddhist thought, of the Buddhist teachings had arisen, and so he actually wrote a whole book about how do you distinguish what are interpretive meanings of sutras and definitive meaning, like just the superficial meaning and the deeper actual intended meaning of sutras. Because the Buddha taught, for over 40 years to many different audiences. So he said things that on the surface are very contradictory, like that a self exists, that there's an enduring self that goes from life to life in some sutras, that no self exists in other sutras, that things are established by from their own side, by force of their own characteristics, or that nothing is established from its own side. Everything that appearance is just totally illusory. In one sutra, the Buddha he taught, to one disciple, you should kill your mother and father. Right? He said, yeah, it's a very famous line of the Buddha, because it elicits that reaction. Because you're like, what? How could the Buddha say that? But for that disciple, in that moment, it had a very specific meaning that he came to understand, and it led him to realization. So on the surface, the Buddha said many different things, right? So it's ripe ground for misinterpretations to arise. So yeah, but basically it comes down to, you have to, and that's why in Tibetan Buddhism there's so much emphasis on not just taking every word of every sutra at face value, but comparing and then using your own logic and reason and kind of insight, and then also the insights of the commentaries, looking at the authoritative commentaries by commentators who seem to have developed high realizations or were prophesied by the Buddha that they would clarify his teachings in the future, like Nagarjuna and the Sangha are the two foremost. But and then comparing with your own experience, as the Buddha himself said, always check my teachings like a goldsmith does by cutting, like a goldsmith analyzes gold by cutting, rubbing, and burning. Don't take them out of respect for me. Right? So we always, in the end, we have to check with our own experience. This is something that seems to ring true with my own experience or not. But, and then there's other things like looking at, because as historically, Buddha's, the Buddha taught in northern India, central India. And then as his teachings spread, they were translated to Pali, and then to Chinese, and then later to Tibetan. And then many of the originals were lost, right, in ancient India. But if you can find, similar sutras that exist in Pali, Chinese, and Tibetan, then you can be quite certain, and they're all very similar, that it actually is something the Buddha taught. But there's a lot of questions around, how to verify the historical accuracy of the Buddha as a person and what he taught. And there's a lot of differing views about that. Like I mentioned yesterday, there's this huge division between the Theravada tradition and like the Tibetan and even the Chinese tradition of what sutras are actually spoken by the Buddha and what are fabrications what are some things that were made up later and said to be the word of the Buddha, but are actually not. There's a lot of disagreement about that. But this is from the Pali Canon, this sutra. Actually, this is a whole text I just discovered when I was searching around doing research, because there's a Dhammapada, but then those verses I just showed you, but then there's this whole text. You can see it's 1,250 pages long, and it seems to be sutras from which the verses of the Dhammapada were taken, right? And this is the one, verses 188 through 192 is what I just showed you. And this is a sutra which it tells the story of in the context in which the Buddha spoke those words about refuge. So let's read it. briefly. Although it's a bit long, I warn you. But it's a nice story. But it does raise a lot of questions about, well, what does it mean to go for refuge? And why do people go for refuge? Because you can see the reasons. The people here who go for refuge to the Buddha Dharma Sangha is radically different from what we would, I don't know, what our experience. I don't know, you'll see. While residing in Jetavana Monastery, so this is in near current-day Rajgir in India. Actually, I just visited this monastery last year. In Rajgir? It's in Bihar. Yeah, near Gaya in Bihar. While residing at the Jetavana Monastery, the Buddha spoke these verses with reference to Aggidatta, a Brahmin, so a Brahmin priest. It appears that Aggidatta was the house priest of the Mahakoshala, so it's a kingdom. When Mahakoshala is a king, Mahakoshala died, his son, King Pasenadi Kosala. So this is in the Kosala kingdom. Yeah, which actually, maybe I'm mistaken, because the Kosala kingdom, anyway, I'm not sure that was the one in Rajgir. Anyway, we'll give it aside. Out of respect for Aggidatta, since he had been his father's house priest, reappointed him to the same post, right? So the son who became king reappointed this priest to the same post he'd had when his father was the ruler. When Aggidatta came to wait upon the king would go forth to meet him and would provide him with a seat of equal dignity with himself and say to him, "Teacher, pray sit here." After a time, however, Aggidatta thought to himself, "This king pays me very great deference, but it is impossible to remain in the good graces of kings. But it is impossible to remain in the good graces of kings for good in all. Life in a king's household is very pleasant for one who is of equal age with the king. But I am an old man, and therefore I had best become a monk." Right. So this is kind of common view in ancient India, is that the time to leave the home life and become a monk is as an old person, right? So and he's a priest. He's becoming old, but there's this new king comes in. He's thinking like, I'm not sure my situation is stable, so I think I'll just leave and go practice kind of on my own. Accordingly, Aggidatta asked permission of the king to become a monk, caused a drum to be beaten throughout the city, means made a pronouncement throughout the city, spent all of his wealth by way of alms in the course of a week, and retired from the world. So all the wealth he accumulated as the royal priest, then he made offerings to the poor and the sick, and then to religious practitioners, and then went forth as a renunciate, and retired from the world, becoming a monk of a heretical order. So that term heretical order here basically means a non-Buddhist order, right, at that time. So it could mean Jain, could mean one of the different Hindu sects, but it's whatever. It's a non-Buddhist kind of religious practitioners. A great number of men. I mean, the heretical order. It's a bit controversial translation, because, the Buddhism doesn't really so much have the idea of heresy, but here it means like not a non-Buddhist order, not in the Christian sense at least. A great number of men followed to become monks. Aggidatta with his monks, so a great number of the men, because he was a royal priest, so he was famous, and so a lot of the men thought, oh, if he's going to go become a monk, then I'll follow him. He's kind of, they looked to him as a teacher, I suppose. So there were many men from that area went to become monks. Aggidatta with his monks took up his residence on the frontier of the country of Angas and Magadha. Yes, Rajgir is the center of the Magadha kingdom, not the Kosala kingdom. So maybe I think I'm mistaken about the Jetavana grove. The Magadhas and the country of the Kurus. So kind of a wild area, right? Having so done, he addressed his monks as follows. "Friends, in case any of you should be troubled with unlawful thoughts, whether lustful, malevolent, or cruel, let each one of you so troubled fill a jar with sand from the river and empty the same in this place." So he's pointing out the place where they're like living and meditating. He's saying, if any of you have these kind of disturbing thoughts, then take a jar, go fill it with sand in the river, and then come back and empty it here. Right? It's a kind of bizarre practice, but whatever. Maybe it helps. I don't know. I can imagine. You could imagine it would help. Like if you have a very like a lustful thought, and then you have to go to the river and fill a jar with sand, like it's kind of a pain, yeah, and then carry it back and dump it out, and everybody sees you doing it, then it's quite a motivation to be like, okay, keep the mind like pure. Anyway, we'll see what happens. Very well, said the monks, promising to do so. So whenever they were troubled by unlawful thoughts, I mean, unlawful sounds quite serious, right? But it could be just mean immoral. Could be. Anyway, whether lustful, malevolent, or cruel, they did as he had commanded them to do. In the course of time, there arose a great heap of sand, right? And Ahichata, king of the Nagas, or the dragons, they say. Anyway, Nagas took possession of it. So there's this Naga who decided, I'm going to dwell in this big pile of sand. No? And the dwellers, yeah, usually snakes, not dragons, like powerful snakes, yeah. The dwellers in Anga and Magadha and the dwellers in the kingdom of the Kurus, month by month, brought rich offerings in honor of those monks, right? So people in the area brought offerings to make to this community. Now, Agidata admonished them as follows: so surely as you seek refuge in a mountain, so surely as you seek refuge in a forest, so surely as you seek refuge in a grove, so surely as you seek refuge in a tree, even so surely will you obtain release from all suffering. With this admonition did Agidata admonish his disciples. So it means Agidata is saying is his disciples, actually it's in reference to the pile of sand. It becomes clear later. But he's kind of like saying this pile of sand here in my community is like a sacred thing. As surely as you'll gain protection by going for refuge in mountains and forests and things, you'll receive protection by coming to make offerings to my community. And it seems to have like this pile of sand somehow, but anyway, we'll see. At this time, the future Buddha, I'm not sure why it says future, because he's already enlightened here. But anyway, it says, at this time, the future Buddha, after going forth on the great retirement, so it says after going forth as renunciate, and after attaining complete enlightenment, see it says, he's already enlightened, took up his residence at Jetavana Monastery, near Savatthi. Surveying the world at dawn, he perceived that the Brahmin, Agidata, together with his disciples, had entered the net of his knowledge. So he considered within himself, do all these living beings possess the faculties requisite for arhatship? So he's seeing with his clairvoyance, seeing Agidata and his followers, and asking, do all these living beings possess the faculties requisite for arhatship? Do they have the potential to achieve the state of an arhat, to be freed from the suffering of samsara? Perceiving that they possessed the requisite faculties, he said in the evening to Venerable Moggallana, Moggallana, do you observe that the Brahmin Agidata is urging upon the multitude a course of action other than the right one? Go and admonish them. And Moggallana replies, Venerable, these monks are very numerous. And if I go alone, I fear that they will prove to be intractable. But if you also go, they will be tractable. And then the Buddha says, Moggallana, I will also go, but you go ahead. Right, so Moggallana is of the Buddha's foremost two disciples, Shariputra and Moggallana. Moggallana is the one Shariputra is foremost in wisdom, and Moggallana is foremost in psychic powers, like clairvoyance and ability to show miracles and things. So at this time, Moggallana is with the Buddha, and Moggallana is also clairvoyant, which is why the Buddha says, Moggallana, do you observe that the Brahmin Agidata, or Moggallana might have heard from other people, what's going on in the area. But for whatever reason, the Buddha says, do you see that these that the Brahmin Agidata is urging or teaching people a sort of wrong, a mistaken kind of spiritual practice, religious practice? And Moggallana doesn't answer, no. But the Buddha just says, but Moggallana just says, I guess by saying he's kind of agreeing, but he's saying, if I go alone, basically I'm going to get beat up. No, Buddha, you better come with me, right? They're intractable. And later you see Moggallana seems to be kind of afraid for his safety when he goes. And then the Buddha says, no, I'll come along, but you go first and then I'll come later. And you see how that works out. It works out perfectly. As the Venerable proceeded, so as Moggallana went, he thought to himself, these monks are both powerful and numerous. If I say a word to them, when they are all gathered together, they will rise against me in troops. So it's like they'll gang up on me and maybe, beat me up or something. Therefore, by his own supernatural power, he caused great drops of rain to fall from the sky. Right? So Moggallana causes it to rain. When those great drops of rain fell, the monks arose, one after another, and each entered his own bower of leaves and grass. So they each went to their own grass huts, right? So they can't see what Moggallana's up to. Then the Venerable went and stood at the door of Aggidatta's leafy hut and called out, Aggidatta, right? Just like their friends. When Aggidatta heard the sound of the Venerable's voice, he thought to himself, there was no one in this world who was able to address me by name. Like, who would just call me by name? Like, how disrespectful. Who can it be that thus addresses me by name? And in the stubbornness of pride, he replied, who is that? Who is that? It is I. And what, is it I? Who is saying that? He replied, so in the stubbornness of pride, no. Who is this saying? So Aggidatta asked, no, he's thinking to himself that, and then Aggidatta replies, who is that? It is I, Brahman. Oh, that's so there, okay. So Moggallana says, it is I, Brahman. Yeah. What if, and then Aggidatta says, what have you to say? And then Moggallana says, show me a place here where I can spend this one night. Give me a place to stay for the night. Aggidatta says, there is no place for you to stay here. Here is but a single hut of leaves and grass for a single monk. Then Moggallana says, Aggidatta, men go to the abode of men. Cattle go to the abode of cattle, and monks to the abode of monks. Do not so? Is this not so? Give me a lodging. And then Aggidatta says, are you a monk? And Moggallana says, yes, I'm a monk. And then Aggidatta says, if you're a monk, where is your alms vessel? What monastic utensils do you have? And then Moggallana says, I have utensils, but since it is inconvenient to carry them about from place to place, I procure them within and then go on my way. So I think he's saying, like, I borrow stuff from people where I go. And then Aggidatta says, so you intend to procure them within and then go on your way? So you want to borrow something from me too? Right? He said, so by this time he's angry, right? Said Aggidatta angrily to the Venerable. The Venerable said to him, so Aggidatta tells him to go away. No, I procure them within and then go my way. So you intend to procure them within and then you go your way? Yeah. Venerable said, so then Moggallana replied, go away, Aggidatta, do not be angry. So he hears that he's angry. He says, don't be angry. Show me a place where I can spend the night. Aggidatta says, there's no lodging here. And then so Moggallana proposes, well, who is it that lives on that pile of sand? Aggidatta says, a certain Naga king. There's a Naga king who lives there. And Moggallana says, give the pile of sand to me. Aggidatta says, I cannot give you the pile of sand. That would be a grievous affront to him. So Aggidatta is kind of afraid of the Naga. He sees it as something very powerful and doesn't want to offend him. Moggallana says, never mind, give it to me. And Aggidatta says, very well, you alone seem to know. Kind of like, okay, whatever, but good luck, right? So then Venerable Moggallana started toward the pile of sand. When the Naga king saw him approaching, he thought to himself, yonder monk approaches hither. Doubtless he does not know that I am here. I will spit fire at him and kill him. This is the Naga, apparently, thing. So then the Venerable Moggallana thought to himself, so Moggallana knows, right? He's clairvoyant. He knows what's going on. This Naga king doubtless thinks I alone am able to spit smoke. Others are not able to do this. So the Venerable spat fire himself. So it's saying Moggallana entered into a concentration on fire and then emitted fire from his body, right? Puffs of smoke arose from the bodies of both and ascended to the world of Brahma. The puffs of smoke gave the Venerable no trouble at all, but troubled the Naga king sorely. I think it probably means fire, actually. I mean, I haven't looked at the Tibetan, but it's probably more like they're shooting fire at each other, right? And Moggallana is totally not fazed, but the Naga king is having quite a difficult time. Well, kind of, yeah. I mean, Moggallana's, his aim is not a pile of sand. His aim is to convert all these people to Buddhism, right? But this is the means, right? The Naga king, unable to stand the blasts of smoke, burst into flames. The venerable applied himself to meditation on the element of fire and entered into a state of trance. Thereupon he burst into flames, which ascended to the world of Brahma. His whole body looked as if it had been set on fire with torches. The company of sages, but by this time there's other monks around that have come out of their huts and are looking to see what's going on, right? The company of sages looked on and thought to themselves, the Naga king is burning the monk. The good monk has indeed lost his life by not listening to our words, right? By not listening to our teacher, Aggidatta. When the venerable had overmastered the Naga king and made him quit his misdoing, he seated himself on the pile of sand. Thereupon the Naga king surrounded the pile of sand with good things to eat, and creating a hood as large as the interior of a peak house, like a good house, held it over the venerable's head. It's actually in Bodh Gaya, you see there's a well-known statue of Shakyamuni Buddha behind the main temple in the middle of a pond, and there's a Naga, like a huge Naga holding his, like with his, what do they call him? The hood, the hood, holding his hood over the Buddha, protecting him from rain. I think there's a story from Buddha's life where something similar happened, although I don't remember clearly. Do any of you know that story? Okay, but there is a Naga also protected the Buddha. So this is Moggallana. So this Naga king was subdued by Moggallana, and then the Naga king, out of respect, then he makes offerings of food and surrounds him and holds his hood over Moggallana to give him protection, right? So then, but by this time, I guess all the monks had gone back to bed. So then early in the morning, the company of sages thought to themselves, we will find out whether the monk is dead or not. They go look for his body, right? So they went to where the venerable was, and when they saw him sitting on a pile of sand, they did reverence to him and praised him and said, monk, you must have been greatly plagued by the Naga king, right? Do you see? And then Moggallana replies, do you not see him standing there with his hood raised over my head? Right? Then said the sages, what a wonderful thing the monk did in conquering so powerful a Naga king. And they stood in a circle about the venerable. Right? So they're very impressed that this Naga, who they were kind of afraid of, they thought, he's more powerful than them, even than their teacher, then Moggallana kind of subdued. At that moment, the Buddha drew near. So now the Buddha comes, right? At that moment, the Buddha drew near. The venerable, seeing the Buddha, arose and saluted him. Said the sages to the venerable, is this man greater than you? The venerable replied, this is the Buddha. I am only his disciple, right? The Buddha seated himself on the summit of the pile of sand. The company of sages said to each other, if such is the supernatural power of a mere disciple, what must the supernatural power of this man be like? And extending their clasped hands in an attitude of reverent salutations, they bestowed praise on the Buddha. The Buddha said to Aggidatta, in giving admonition to your disciples and supporters, how do you admonish them? Right? The Buddha already knows the answer, right? Aggidatta replied, I admonish them thus, seek refuge in this mountain, seek refuge in this forest or grove or tree. For he who seeks refuge in these obtains release from all suffering. The Buddha said, no, indeed, Aggidatta, he who seeks refuge in those does not obtain release from suffering. But he who seeks refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, he obtains release from the round of suffering. So that's where those verses come from in the Dhammapada. At the conclusion, although you see it doesn't have the lines about, because I don't think there's no other verses. Anyway, the verses come to follow. Because here in this, what he says to Aggidatta, it doesn't have the lines about the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths. At the conclusion of the lesson, all of those sages attained arhatship. So then the Buddha went on to give them a teaching. That's what it's saying. I guess he's taught them about the Four Noble Truths, it would seem, right? At the conclusion of the lesson or the teaching, all of those sages attained arhatship, together with the superhuman faculties, together with psychic powers. Thereupon, they saluted the Buddha and asked to be admitted to the Sangha. The Buddha stretched out his hand from under his robe and said, "Come, monks, lead the religious life." That very instant, they were furnished with the 8 requisites and became, as it were, monks of 100 years. It means they became kind of as well established in the practice of being an ordained person as if they'd already been ordained 100 years. They became very subdued in their minds. And this is an example of before, it's called ngocho, the early ritual, or the former or the early ritual for giving ordination, where this is how the Buddha would give refuge or give ordination in the first about 10 years after he was enlightened, that he would just say, like, "Come forth," and then doing that would bestow ordination, as opposed to more elaborate ceremonies that were established by the Buddha a little later in his life, and that we use till today for giving refuge and giving vows, giving ordination. Now, this was the day when all the dwellers in Anga and in Magadha and in the country of the Kurus were accustomed to come with rich offerings. When, therefore, they approached with their offerings and saw that all those sages had become monks, they thought to themselves, "Is our Brahmin, Aggidatta, great, or is the monk Gautama great?" And because the Buddha had just arrived, they concluded, "Aggidatta alone is great." The Buddha surveyed their thoughts, so again with his clairvoyance, he knows what they're thinking, and said, "Aggidatta, destroy the doubt that exists in the minds of your disciples." Aggidatta replied, "That is the very thing I desire to do." So by superhuman power, he rose 7 times in the air, and descending to the ground, he saluted the Buddha and said, "Venerable, you are my teacher, and, and I am your disciple." Thus did Aggidatta speak, declaring himself the disciple of the Buddha. So in short, a huge number of people were converted to Buddhism by this act. I mean, surely the Buddha knew that, all those people are going to come on the next day. Yes.
So Geshe-la, in the surface value, if you just look at it on the surface, I feel like there is no way that Buddha might have said this, because it just feels like...
What have said what?
At least in the last part where he says, "Aggidatta, don't, you should destroy the doubt that they have." Or he sends the Venerable to go and convert them all to Buddhism. And that there was like fire and exchange of fire and all that. The reason I feel like it just seems very surface level is because I just feel like it shows the Buddha to be quite egotistical. I don't know if that is indeed the case, where he says, Venerable, go do this, Aggidatta, go do this. I'm sure there's a background of him having given the Dharma and him having taught these disciples and monks what the path is before commanding them. And I'm sure there's also mistranslations, because it doesn't seem as though there is a command, because the way it's written, it seems as though he is wanting everyone to come to the way of path, when in reality that's not it. He's always asking people to question the logical sense before they come. But there is no, there's nothing in the sutra about him telling the disciples that they have to question on why they're coming here before they're actually coming. He's just commanding people to get them. At least that's what it appears on face value, which I feel like it may be untrue.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's good to be skeptical, but what you have to think, well, first of all, there's a difference between doing something egotistical and being like a good leader, right? So he's kind of like Moggallana is his disciple, no? One of his main disciples. So to tell Moggallana to go do something is not out of the usual, no? That's not egotistical, it's just, and also you have to think in the context of the Buddha's, like it says in the beginning, with his clairvoyance, he's looking to see who is it that I can benefit, basically, today. Who is it that is a ripe vessel to receive the teachings, like the true teachings, right? He's not just going anywhere, telling anyone, do this, do that, or just like that, but he's looking to see like who is it that's a suitable receptacle for the path that I have to teach, right?
Right.
And then seeing that, oh, these people, they have the right kind of disposition to
Right.
be able to receive the teaching. But then he's sort of figuring out, but how can we make that come about? That they want to hear what he has to teach. Because imagine, if he had just gone there to teach uninvited, they would have told him, just go away, right? And also...
But there's a certain like forceful element to this, which is definitely not Buddhism.
I don't think so.
Like forceful as in like,
yeah.
you have to come here.
But he's
we'll
not
sit-
saying you have to.
But
Where is the you have to do this or you have to
I'm
do that?
commanding
Well,
you to
Well,
tell them.
Buddha to his disciple Moggallana, he's saying you do this.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
I
but
mean,
that's not-
no one's going to spew rain and fire and smoke.
Yeah,
and
all those supernatural like aspects of it. Yeah, you have to
like
take
if
it
you
with a
do,
grain
if
of
you don't
salt.
come, I'll spew rain on you. If you don't come, I'll spew smoke on you.
No, but Moggallana didn't say that. No,
But he did that, right?
no,
Like,
he did that. Yeah,
Yes.
because the Naga was attacking him that way, right?
Yeah, but in the beginning, he's like had rain on them.
Yeah. He
yeah.
rained on them, yeah. But
Yes.
he didn't say, like, if you don't do this, I'm going to rain on you. That was
Yeah.
just his skillful means to kind of disperse
Scatter.
the crowd, right?
No, I'm simply saying that on face value, it appears to be like, oh, there's rain, there's smoke, there's commands, and so on. But there is probably a much deeper interpretation of this that is much more peaceful and a much more calmer way of enticing
not sure.
disciples. Really? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just
I don't-
questioning.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's all, I mean, it would all be considered, because remember, the Buddha's, his main objective is to free sentient beings from suffering, right? And, I mean, like he says at the beginning, when he asks Moggallana, basically he asks him, is the teacher Aggidatta, is he basically saying, is he leading his disciples on a correct path or a mistaken path? On a path that's going to free them from suffering or a path that's not going to free them from suffering? And then he's basically saying Aggidatta is leading them on a path which is not going to lead them, is not going to free them from suffering, right? And so out of compassion then for those disciples, then he wants to set them on a path that will bring them to freedom from suffering. No? It's not especially, I think like an egotistical thing would be if he wants them to, to worship him. And he, on the basis of that, he wants to accumulate power and wealth and kind of fame and so forth. It's like, yes, the Buddha does accumulate fame, but that's not the objective. The objective is to free sentient beings from suffering, right? So you have to see it in that light, no? But then all the things about the supernatural powers and things, yeah, you have to, if you think that's real or not real, like, it's up to you. It's not sure. Yeah, it's just part of the story. Yeah. But, sure. Yeah.
Okay, my understanding is this is like the way that the Buddha subdued the minds of the disciples, right? Through supernatural powers, and it seems it's common. Like there's so many stories that way, so it seems that that's kind of a common way of how not just the Buddha, but I've heard like of sometimes it's kind of like maybe in the more ancient times, shall we say, that's kind of how the master subdued the minds of the future disciples. And I guess that's what I want to try to get to, if that's kind of the right understanding. Although I have to say, Kandrala has released her bio, and I would love.
Recently?
Well, no, it's been a while.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
you probably read it, Geshe?
No.
Maybe I'll
But
share
I know
it with you.
some stories from her
Yeah.
life. I've heard.
I mean,
but
it
don't know.
involves a lot of supernatural power.
Uh-huh.
Yes, so I would love to. I mean, and we're talking about a living, enlightened being.
Yeah.
So I would, maybe if that's something we can
Sure.
study.
Yeah, like a class how to develop supernatural powers.
Not study, but like to like compare because I think I'm saying this because it seems
No, it's
like
a big
in
question.
the
It's an
modern
important, yeah.
day, the way to subdue the minds of the sentient beings is through reasoning, right? But then there
Yeah,
are different ways of doing it. I think that's what I was trying to get to.
yeah,
And I'm not saying there's like one way is better than others, but because this is the world where we believe in science and
yeah.
reasons, and this is how we can be convinced. But in the old days, or maybe in the different culture, it's going to
Uh-huh.
be different methods.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and you see this throughout the Buddhist sutras, and yeah, also you see it in the Hindu teachings. All the supernatural powers, right? It becomes a bit over the top sometimes. We think, and the Mahayana sutras even more than like in the Pali Canon. The Mahayana sutras have so many supernatural things going on, but yeah. Well, I think, and then it's true. Like now in our current day context, it just seems like just pure fantasy and pure stories, right? So what do we do with that, right? Well, there's different ways to look at it. I mean, one way is to start. I think first of all, I think we have a tendency, like in a modern developed kind of society, country, to with all the kind of material progress that has been achieved through science, we have a tendency to think that science is the end all be all of like knowledge, right? And that anything that science can't or mainstream science, just to say, can't establish is like it's just fantasy. That's not real. But actually, I mean, you look at some fields of science, like quantum mechanics, for example. There's a lot of aspects of quantum mechanics that are purely mysterious. Like nobody can explain why subatomic particles act in those ways. Why at sometime it's like the double slit experiment. Why when you fire a proton, it's a molecule. What am I saying? A molecule versus a wave versus not a molecule, particle. When you fire the proton, it's a particle, but then it seems that by the interference pattern you get on the plate in the back, when there's no observer, then no observer at the slits, then it seems to act as a wave. No, so is it a particle or a wave, and why, and how does it transform between one and another, and how does the act of observation play a role or not? As an example, right? There's many things. So even in science, there's a lot of room for like unexplained phenomena. Also, I mean, this big question of how does the mind affect the body? How does the body affect the mind? This interaction. How does like science can't explain how even scientists who want to say the mind is what the brain does. They can't explain like what is it in the brain that produces conscious experience. Even something as simple as how are memories stored in the brain. Like no scientist can explain that. How do we have so much? You think of all the experiences we had in our life that we can remember. Forget about the ones we can't remember. Okay, to leave aside all the things we can remember. If you were to quantify that in terms of bytes, like data, that's just an infinite amount of data, no? But how is it stored in the neurons of the brain? Like we know how to store that kind of data on chips, but not in the physical stuff of the brain. Like how does that work? So there's a lot of things that science doesn't know. So we have to be a bit more humble, I think, than we ordinarily are about what we know exists and what we know doesn't exist. Like in regard to past and future lives, His Holiness often says, because he's in these dialogues with scientists again and again, none of who believe in past and future lives, but His Holiness believes, right? So he often says, well, while through methods of science, you can't establish that past and future lives exist, but you can also prove that they do not exist, right? It's something beyond the methods of physical science, right, to establish. But then if you look in, and kind of I'm leading up to answer Bay's question, is kind of we have to broaden our perspective. And I mean, each of you individually, I don't know where you stand, but you have to, for most people, we have to broaden our perspective a bit of what's possible. Like, and not just assume what the physical things we ordinarily see every day, like that's all that's possible. And reality is just limited to that. Like, there are, even you look at like more, I don't know, sort of, I don't know, peripheral fields of science, like investigation of clairvoyance, for example, or distant viewing, or different psychic powers. There's a lot of research, actually. When you start looking into it, there's a lot of really good research. Or like Ian Stevenson's Children Who Remember Past and Future Lives. I mean, there's a lot of very objective scientists doing research, and they always like lose tenure, and they don't get published, and they're not in mainstream journals, so you don't hear about it. You have to dig a lot, you know, a lot more to find out. But there's a lot of really good scientific research that actually gives a lot of evidence for many paranormal phenomena that we don't think ordinary, or even like split personality disorder. Or like we've been talking, I think we were talking about in some session, people being spirit possession, people being possessed by spirits, and then even speaking languages they don't ordinarily know in that state. So then what's going on there? First of all, that's evidence for some kind of stream of consciousness that we can't see. It's not human, and it's not animal, which opens up the door for a whole nother kind of existence we don't ordinarily accept. And then also like the studies of clairvoyance, like there's many show that most people have some degree of clairvoyance. Like you put, I don't know, I won't explain the experiments now, but if you're interested, you can look into. You basically, a common experience is you put two people in separate rooms and then show one like cards, like pictures of cards, and they ask the other one in the other room what the other person is looking at. And more than chance, more than 50% of the time, they can guess what the other person is looking at. Of course, not every time, but more than, like if there's a 50-50 chance they're looking at this image or that image, the person can guess. And then back to Kondrala's story, I mean, Kondrala's biography, which I don't know about, but I've heard some stories. But I think more broadly, like if you talk to, I mean, students of Lama Geshe, like in Vajrapani Institute, there's many old students of Lama Geshe. Many of them have stories about that seem to indicate these miraculous powers and clairvoyant abilities of, like just the other day at lunch, I think just yesterday at lunch, I was talking to one old student, and he was saying while he was doing this one retreat, you know, he'd been married his whole life and then divorced and had a girlfriend and then was doing this retreat. And during the retreat, he was feeling like, you know, finally he's not in the context of being with a partner. He's just on his own and really enjoying kind of the connection with Dharma he was having, and thinking, oh, I think I want to become a monk. But feeling like, because he has kids and he has an ex-wife and a girlfriend, and thinking like, oh, this is just not possible. So he said, I started making prayers to my teacher, to Lama Zopa Rinpoche, that I can become a monk. and then at the end of the retreat, he had a chance just to go to Rinpoche's house in Aptos just before Rinpoche was about to leave for the airport, and was just, you know, I think Roger, the attendant, told him, who just spoke here the other night, was saying, oh, Rinpoche doesn't have time, we're in a rush, we have to leave, he can't see you now. So he was just helping put the bags in the car and thought to just wait and offer a kata when Rinpoche left. And then someone came down and said, Roger, Rinpoche wants you to come up to his room, to this person. So then he went up to Rinpoche's room, and long and short, Rinpoche had a stack of robes saying, oh, you know, do you want to take ordination? So it's like, yeah, it seems like Rinpoche knows. There's many stories like that from Rinpoche's students that, like, you know, he can see, and not just Lama Zopa Rinpoche, many teachers, there's stories that they have clairvoyance. They can see what's going on in the students of the, and not just in Tibetan tradition, the Theravada tradition also. There's this famous biography of Ajahn Mun, Ajahn Mun, I believe. He was a Thai forest master. You know Ajahn Mun? Yeah, about him, like his students, they all were convinced he totally reads their minds. Like while in a teaching, he just starts speaking to one monk about like what, you know, improper thoughts they're having. So the monks are all like totally afraid to be in his presence because they feel like he can see their mind. And if he sees something improper that they're thinking, he'll start like scolding them for it, basically. And he would teach devas at night. Apparently gods from other realms would come to his dwelling at night and he would teach them. Now, how they know that, like, I don't know, but even like His Holiness Dalai Lama, like so many people just being in the presence of the Dalai Lama, their mind is very moved in a way that's just not ordinary, right? It's not just by seeing or hearing or something. It's some kind of direct effect on the mind, you know? So I think, yeah, once you start thinking about those things, like yeah, then it sort of opens your mind to like, okay, more is possible than we ordinarily think. I mean, many people have that kind of experience when they start like trying drugs, when they like smoke marijuana or take LSD, and I'm not, or other psychedelics. I'm not saying you should do that, but it's common experience among many people that they kind of, some drugs or some, meditation or different traumatic experiences, all different kinds of experiences, because they open your mind to sort of different aspects of reality that ordinarily we just don't perceive, right? So, yeah. So then when you read a story like this, yeah, we can't, it's not sure what's going on. We just have to kind of use your imagination. And yes, there could be a strong, what do you say? You imagine like something happened during something like this happened during the Buddha's life, and then later, for hundreds of years, people are reciting that story, the sutra that recounts that story. There's a strong impetus to maybe elaborate a bit, right? To make it a bit more entertaining, a bit more impressive, right? But we can. But so yeah, maybe some of the more, I don't know, fantastical things, maybe that's not all part of the real story. But certainly the essence of the story is that the Buddha could see that there's a group of this very influential teacher and an influential set of disciples that had the potential to receive the Buddha's teachings at that time, that were on a mistaken path, that were just worshiping mountains and trees and things, but had the potential to understand and to deeply understand and realize the Four Noble Truths, right? And so he, sent Moggallana to introduce that, and then he went and taught them, and they were converted, and then a lot of other people followed, which would have been a huge event, right, in that time and place. So we can think there must be something there, otherwise, it's like someone just created a story out of thin air, right? Which seems not likely. So I don't know. Does that answer your question a bit, Bay? I don't know. I know that's a very long answer. Huh? Yeah. But anyway, I think those are some ways to kind of consider, okay, what does it mean when we see this discussion of different, like Roger said the other night, like he was Rinpoche's attendant for 4 years. I mean, he said, like Lama Zopa Rinpoche, he never saw him lay down and sleep, like in 40 years. Even he had a stroke, right? And before Rinpoche had a stroke, I was around Rinpoche, not as much as, not anything like Venerable Roger, but enough. Like one time I was in Dharamsala at Tushita Meditation Center. Rinpoche came to visit, and he would call, Geshe Namdak was there too. He would call both of us to his room at night around 10:30, 11, to do some pujas in the evening. And we would stay till, about 3 or 4 times. We'd stay till 1 at night. And then a couple of times, like I was the last one to leave the room. And then Rinpoche is just setting up, like Roger said, he's like asking, where's my iPad? I want this text and stuff. And he's setting up just to like keep going, all night long. And you leave, there's some kind of energy. You just get like, you get kind of high. Being around Rinpoche, you get this kind of buzz. Like even, ordinarily I'd be heading to bed, at that time. Even like now, like I'd be tired by the end of the day and heading to go to sleep at 10:30, 11. But then you go and you're with Rinpoche and, it's fun. He tells some jokes. It's like, it's just nice to be. But you feel there's a subtle kind of energy that you feel. And then I'd go back to my room at 1 o'clock thinking like, I'm going to drop in bed, but you can't. Like, you're just like kind of buzzing from this energy that Rinpoche has. And everybody around Rinpoche could feel it. Like they could just do way more than you ordinarily could in terms of like anything you're doing, but especially Dharma practice, riding on Rinpoche's energy. So I can't imagine being the person who's radiating that to other people. Like, not to mention, it says in just the teachings about meditative concentration, right? That if you generate just calm abiding, and say even the first jhana of the 4 jhanas, then you don't need to sleep anymore because your mind is so focused that you just maintain this kind of mental energy. We lose so much energy by having a distracted mind. Our mind just jumping around. Every time we think about something, some energy that goes out. And like all day, you can see when you're really thinking about a lot of different things, or you're like, go to some place and you're just like looking around, you feel exhausted afterwards because your energy has just been going out, out, out. So if you really control your energy, then you can kind of imagine how, yeah, maybe you don't need that. That becomes a physical sustenance, that energy. You don't need like gross food or sleep or things so much. Yeah, anyway, that's another. But that, yeah, not sleeping is kind of, we would think, oh, that's supernatural. But actually, but there's a logical explanation for why maybe that's possible, right? Yeah.
Venerable Raja also talked about a few stories.
Oh yeah, also the mosquitoes. Rinpoche letting mosquitoes bite him.
The spirits that
Oh yeah, all the
overtaken
spirit.
a child, and how Rinpoche finally convinced the spirit to take refuge.
Yeah. Yeah, that's also, we'd consider totally supernatural. Yeah, were you here for that, Madhu? Oh yeah, yeah. Not the sharks. Oh, that's just releasing animals, though. That wasn't supernatural or anything. Yeah, it's just compassionate. Rinpoche's compassion. Yeah, sorry for you. But I know we're mentioning all these stories we don't have time to tell. Yeah, Venerable Raja Rinpoche's attendant was telling about some. He got in. I never heard him do that before, but he got into some stories about Rinpoche when he was teaching. Sometimes people would get possessed by spirits and go into kind of trance, and how Rinpoche would deal with that, and kind of, what would you call this? Exorcism, kind of exercise, but in a very peaceful way, just by like talking with the spirit and trying to figure out what it wants, what it needs, and then how to kind of give the spirit what it wants and also convince it to leave the body of the person it's possessing. Yeah. I never heard quite it done like that, but anyway. But back to refuge now, and then maybe actually, why don't we take a break, actually? We break for 5 minutes or so. Okay, let's continue. I thought now we'll turn to the definition of refuge. But maybe first, just to kind of transition from this sutra we're looking at in these verses from the Dhammapada. Well, I mean, just thinking about, how did these Aggidatta and his disciples and other people, how was it that they went for refuge? And then, and also when we look at the definition of refuge, does it seem like they fulfilled that or not? And then also comparing to, when we were looking at yesterday, when we were thinking about the reasons that we turn to something for refuge, especially in a crisis in our life, and then in relation to Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, like what is it that is a cause for us to entrust ourselves to something in the kind of in the deepest way we can as a human being. So yeah, thinking, just a bit more about this sutra, it's like, I have to imagine, okay, Aggidatta was this royal priest, then left to seek, to basically engage in spiritual practice away from the distractions of the court and maybe the possible kind of, discomfort. And then many people followed him. So then he's, in ancient India with a group of followers, engaging in spiritual practice, which, even in ancient India, it was common to all the different religious sects that their objective is moksha. No, that's not something unique to Buddhism, that the objective to achieve a sort of the most stable, lasting form of peace and happiness and freedom from suffering possible, right? So yeah, that's assuming that's their goal, and then they see Moggallana come and totally overpower this kind of naga, the serpent kind of being that's in their midst, and that they're a bit afraid of. yeah, then they're very impressed by that. And then seeing that Moggallana is the disciple of the Buddha, then they're impressed that the Buddha has a disciple like that has that kind of power. So I think, if we can sort of summarize that in the context of these are people who are trying to cultivate spiritual power, basically. Not just psychic powers, but the ability to control one's mind, the ability to, because why is the whole pile of sand there in the first place? Because they're trying to reduce disturbing forces in their mind, afflictive emotions and improper thoughts, like in their minds. Probably primarily by, I don't know, who knows, maybe by prayer or mantra or by generating more refined states of mental concentration, mental focus, right? Remember all the jhanas, the concentrations of the form realms, the 4 concentrations of the formless realms, those are all common to both Buddhist and non-Buddhist, right? So that was a big part of spiritual practice in ancient India. But then they see this this one practitioner, Moggallana, who seems to have kind of more control over his mind than any of them can then have, as evidenced by his ability to engage in this kind of a duel of psychic powers with this Naga. Because the basis of psychic powers is actually meditative concentration. The more refined the degree of one's meditative concentration is, as I read in one, there's one excellent book. If you're interested in more about these kind of paranormal phenomena, there's one excellent book by this psychologist who at one point was the president of the I think American Psychological Association, so totally mainstream psychologist, Elizabeth Meyer. Elizabeth Meyer's her name. So the book is called Extraordinary Knowing. And it comes, her whole experience with psychic powers and things came to, and this is just an aside, but it came about because her daughter lost a very expensive cello, actually in San Francisco or Oakland somewhere. And then she tried everything to find it and eventually was desperate, and a friend suggested she try someone who does dowsing, but from a long distance, which so she contacted this dowser in Alabama, and he said, send me a picture of the cello and a map of the area you live in. And he told her at the location of the cello, and then eventually she got it back from this person who had stolen it. And she was totally mystified, like, how could this person in Alabama know the location of my daughter's cello? So obviously it's some kind of clairvoyance, right? But he used dowsing as a technique. And then she got interested in this whole field of paranormal, what are considered, paranormal phenomena. Anyway, and then she wrote this book about all her research and how about what she learned and how so much of the research into those phenomena is totally kind of pushed aside by mainstream science. So why was this talking about that? About psychic powers. I was saying, anyway, she also, as part of her research, she interviews people who have clairvoyance, or claim to have clairvoyance. There's even people who even have schools where they teach other people to develop clairvoyance. But one thing stood out from me from those interviews with people who have clairvoyance or teach others people to develop clairvoyance is that they say, because it makes very much sense in Buddhist practice, is that the main obstacle to developing clairvoyance is our own thoughts. Is we cloud our mind with our own thoughts, and so we don't create space just to be open to basically like the thoughts of others, the other more subtle phenomena. Because thoughts, for the most part, they're very kind of coarse, gross mental phenomena. Whereas they're saying, the more you can just clear your mind of thoughts, the more subtle and receptive your mind is, and that can lead you to be sensitive to and be aware of other people's thoughts and other phenomena at a great distance, which makes sense in the terms of, because in Buddhist, just traditional Buddhist teachings, the basis for generating clairvoyance and other psychic abilities is all meditative concentration, the ability to focus the mind. And as we know, like the biggest obstacle to focusing our mind is discursive thought, right? Distracting thoughts. So it makes sense that the more you have a capacity to focus your attention, then the less your mental continuum is disturbed by distracting thoughts and ideas and perceptions, then the more, and you can see anyone who's done a meditation retreat, you can see within a few days or a few weeks that the mind becomes more calm, like water that's not disturbed by the wind, and then and more clear, right? Your dreams, you can remember, you can see your dreams more clearly, remember your dreams more clearly, and also thoughts. Memories of things that happened long ago and you totally forgotten. They just start bubbling up to the surface, right? That's also indication of the kind of sensitivity that a still mind naturally is imbued with, right? That you become more sensitive and aware of your own memories. Mm. So, all that is kind of evidence for why, this kind of, well, then what's going on in this sutra? That why are this teacher and his group of disciples, why are they so impressed with Moggallana? Yeah, on the surface, it looks like these, in a way, it's like kind of silly psychic powers, but actually I think they're seeing that as an indication of the control over his mind. And then, because it's control over the mind that gives rise to those kinds of abilities. And then thinking that if he has so much control over his mind, then someone who he sees as his teacher must have even greater control over his mind. And actually that relates to the name mantra of Shakyamuni Buddha, Tayata Om Muni Muni Mahamuni Soha. Well, Muni means control. So in Buddha's own name mantra, it's like a praise of his qualities in terms of the degree of control he has over his mind. And that's what also another verse from the Dhammapada, where the Buddha summarizes his own teachings as, do not commit any unwholesome action, perfect every virtuous action, subdue your own mind. This is the teaching of the Buddha. So the Buddha, summarizes the essence of his own teaching as being, a method to control one's mind, to reduce and eliminate destructive forces, and then cultivate and increase as much as possible positive forces, constructive forces in the mind. And so then that brings us to, thinking about refuge, our own, as I mentioned, we were thinking about yesterday, like what, just naturally, without leaving aside the definition of refuge and how refuge is described in classical Buddhist teachings, like why do we turn to, especially in a spiritual context, why do we turn to something for refuge? And on one hand, it can be because there's very destructive things happening in our lives. But in another way, it can be because we see that we don't have control over our own minds. We don't have clarity in our own minds. I know, like I was saying yesterday, for me, a big cause of, I think, going for refuge was just kind of being lost about what to do with my life, and seeing the way that was really undermining my happiness and leading to sort of different destructive behaviors, and really wishing to find clarity. But that's also, just a lack of clarity, confusion about things itself is an indication of, in a way, a lack of control over the mind, an inability to develop mental focus and wisdom, and to distinguish like constructive ways of thinking from destructive ways of thinking, or destructive emotions from positive emotions, which is also a part of a lack of wisdom. So anyway, I think that's kind of a thread that goes through different aspects of why we seek refuge in something in general, and then we'll see more cause for going for refuge specifically to the Buddha Dharma Sangha is due to having faith, and not blind faith, but informed faith that they have the ability to help protect us from suffering by helping us learn to control our own minds and therefore our lives, and this life and future lives better. So let's look at now the definition of refuge, and this is from The larger source. Well, I mean, the definition immediately is from the textbook of that we study at Sarajana, where of the commentary on the Ornament of Clear Realization that we study. Actually, thinking of the Ornament of Clear Realization, it reminds me of this other thing I wanted to explain first. Well, actually, I can explain later. I'll just go with the definition now. But yeah, I'm trying to remember, because I just saw a sutra basis. It's very similar. It has a very similar definition. But anyway, I'll leave it for now. I don't remember it right now. But what he says, basically he's saying refuge, to generate the mind of refuge, it requires two causes, right? One we discussed quite a bit yesterday is kind of a wise fear of suffering. There has to be, a perception of something, some harm that we don't want to befall us, right? And so again, we have to check in our own experience. Generally, I know it's a bit sensitive to talk about fear, because fear is, as I was mentioning the other day in Exploring Buddhism course, is like there's fears. Some types of fear are destructive, and just we want to just reduce and eliminate. But other kinds of fear can be helpful, right? And they actually keep us safe, like realistic fear of potential harm in the future that we need to, like when we're a child and and we're not afraid of a fire, then it's dangerous, right? But as soon as we're burned by a fire for the first time, we realize like, oh, I need to be cautious around that because it has the potential to harm me, right? And so when we're around a fire, then we're cautious not to, or something very hot, cautious not to touch it out of a fear that we'll get burned, right? So that's a kind of protective fear. But then if it can go too far and become like obsessive, and then it undermines our ability to function in a kind of in a smooth and kind of good way, right? So fear is a mental factor that has destructive sides and also destructive instances and also constructive instances. So here is talking about sort of a wholesome fear of different things, of suffering. I mean, in the definition, it's saying that a wise fear of suffering, primarily of there's at different levels. At the lowest level of primarily of rebirth in the lower realms as a hell being, a hungry ghost or an animal, and then the higher level, a fear of suffering of all of samsara as a whole, and wishing to be free from that, recognizing what misery we'll have to continually experience as long as we take rebirth, experience old age, sickness, and death, and then rebirth again and again and again through the force of afflictive emotions. But then and then, I mean, this is the three levels of motivation. In the most kind of the highest way, or a higher way, I think we can go for refuge, not just in order to be protected from suffering ourselves, but in order to protect all sentient beings from suffering, recognizing that not only I, but those I care about, those who are strangers, even those who I dislike, we're all suffering in the same way, in fundamentally the same way. And that not only do I go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha to seek protection and kind of clear guidance on how to be free from this the whole condition, pervasive compounding suffering myself, but also on behalf of all those who are so kind to me, and like me in being trapped in suffering. So that's a much more powerful way of going for refuge. Seeking to go for refuge not only to seek a resolution of my own problems, but to ultimately find a resolution to the problems of all beings, right? So that's also a kind of fear, but on behalf of the suffering of others. So there's a wise fear of suffering, and then a stable faith. And this is the second part that we haven't spoken about much, and that we'll speak about more the rest of today and tomorrow. This is like a stable faith that the three jewels, the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, have the ability actually to help protect me and to help find a solution to the problems that I'm facing. So these are the two causes, right, that we need to have refuge: kind of fear, and then faith in the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. And here, not blind faith, but an informed faith, faith based on understanding. Yeah. Okay, so then the actual definition that is kind of typically used is this. Independence upon the two causes of, one, fear of suffering, and then two, faith in the three jewels, from the depth of one's heart, recognizing that the three jewels, meaning the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, protect from all suffering, right? So recognizing that the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha have the ability, have the power to protect from every form of suffering. Totally and in a way, so having, from the depth of one's heart, having this recognition such that it totally transforming one's mind in this attitude, such that one's mind is deeply moved in this attitude. And then making a promise to therefore to commit oneself to them, right? So it's that you see it has these different elements. The first two elements are these two causes, fear of suffering, and then the faith in the three jewels. And what kind of faith? Recognizing that they have the ability to protect one from suffering. And then not having that just as mere words or just like an intellectual idea, but having that kind of recognition, that faith in a way that moves one's heart, that totally transforms one's mind in this attitude, right? So it's a mind that's feels deeply trusting in, right? And feels like you can totally entrust oneself. There's a deep recognition or a deep, and this only comes about through understanding, right? That why is it that the Buddha is a valid teacher? Why is it that what he taught actually is something that can free me from suffering? I mean, that's not an understanding that comes easily. It comes from understanding, quite deeply what the Buddha taught. I mean, mainly the Four Noble Truths. And then why is it that the Sangha community, those who actually have some experience of what the Buddha taught, some realization of what the Buddha taught, they're a valid community to support me in that practice. And then feeling that such to the degree such that one can totally commit oneself to following this teacher, to following this teaching, and to following or being part of this community. So making a promise, therefore, to commit oneself to the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. So that's the standard definition of the mind of refuge. So that's why I often say when we recite the verse of refuge, to try to, because going for refuge is not just reciting words. I go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, and it's not just doing things like folding your hands or making prostrations. Like none of those things are actually refuge. And there's a huge danger. His Holiness Dalai Lama often points this out. I think in some ways we're more fortunate as people not from a Buddhist family, not from a Buddhist background, to have come to Buddhism as something, people who were seeking something and then to have come to it, because there's like a practice of going for refuge is not something we've grown up with and not something we just kind of habitually do, because those things we're born into a family that practices a certain religion. We grow up with a certain set of prayers and rituals, and it's so easily just to do those automatically without thinking about the meaning. And then if we don't think about the meaning, I mean, you can see refuge requires like understanding the meaning of how we relate to the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, understanding deeply the meaning and the significance of that. It's not just reciting some words or performing some kind of rituals. So that's why oftentimes when we recite because as part of a teaching, we do the ritual of reciting the verse of going for refuge at the beginning, right? But it's so important, like before we do that or as we do that, to try to bring some degree of the mind that refuge actually is. Actually, it's an attitude in the mind, and to generate some degree of that. And again, like so many of the things that we meditate on, just like Tonglen, to be able to do that, bring that mind bring that mind to your awareness in the short term requires spending time meditating on it, in a slow and deliberate way over a long time, right? But that's why we have this weekend on refuge, to look at, how do we approach generating that attitude of refuge, and how can we deepen that attitude of refuge? I was going to mention, because oftentimes His Holiness, what he's speaking about, refuge and just religion in general. He often in the past would mention how he sometimes asked, because His Holiness as the leader of the Tibetan community in exile in India, one of his roles was to go around to the different refugee settlements and see how people are doing. And so in his interaction with, just ordinary everyday Tibetans, he would sometimes ask, do you have refuge? Or what's the difference do you see a difference between Buddhism and other religions? And what is it that differentiates you as a Buddhist from a practitioner of other religions? And His Holiness would say, oftentimes he didn't say really expressly, but you could see he's kind of a bit disappointed in a way that so many people don't really know, even though they identify as being Buddhist. I mean, actually the measure of being a Buddhist is having refuge in your mind, right? Having refuge in Buddha, Dharma, Sangha in your mind. But then if you don't have understanding of how, as a teacher, the Buddha is different from other spiritual teachers, how is he different from Muhammad or Abraham or Jesus or, Shankara or something? How is the Buddha different from other teachers? What is it that he taught, especially that's different from the teachings in other faiths? How is the Sangha community different, and how is the practice of Buddhism different from other religious traditions? Then to say you're Buddhist, if you don't know any of those things, it's just words. No, it's kind of meaningless, right? And maybe here I should also say, again, like I said at the outset, the objective of teaching about refuge is not to make anyone Buddhist, but just, but it is because, when a person generates the refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, is the criterion by which they become Buddhist, right? So it is in understanding refuge. A big part of that is understanding how the Buddha, and especially his teachings, Buddhism, and the practice of his teachings is different from other religious traditions. So while on the one hand, it is extremely important to have respect for and appreciate the deep value that every religious tradition has. I mean, all the major religious traditions clearly bring a lot of benefit to individual practitioners and bring a lot of benefit in the world. And one of the main ways they bring benefit is by teaching us how to practice pure morality, the morality of using our lives in a way that isn't harmful to others, right? And cultivating more kindness, loving kindness and compassion for others. That's something I think you can say universal to all the religions, that we should care for the innocent, we should care for the sick and the poor, that we should abandon killing, stealing, lying, So there's a kind of universal human morality that is taught in all the major religious traditions, and that's excellent, right? So we need to have respect for all the religious traditions, like in that way. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that like every religious tradition alone, practicing that alone, can ultimately free you from samsara, right? And so speaking from a Buddhist point of view, like as long as we don't understand what are the fundamental causes of samsara, of this process of taking rebirth, experiencing old age and death again, and then taking rebirth again and again and again without end. As long as we don't understand the fundamental causes of that, then there's no way to be free from that. So any religious tradition that doesn't contain an explanation of that and doesn't contain explanations, clear explanation of what are the root causes of samsara and what is the remedy to that, right? Then it's impossible by practicing that tradition alone to ultimately be free from the suffering of samsara. And so in that way, like that's why Buddhism is unique, and this is the view of Buddhist practitioners, is that's why Buddhism is, in a way, is unique among spiritual traditions, because it has this clear explanation and this practice that other traditions don't, right? And that's part of generating the mind of refuge. When you think about, why are the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha a valid refuge, right? how can they protect me from suffering? That understanding of that is a big part of it. Is that how can they ultimately protect me from suffering and lead me to lasting happiness? Because the Buddha, as a teacher, clearly identified in his own experience and generated the realization of the Four Noble Truths, and then taught the Four Noble Truths to others. And then the Sangha are those who've generated realization, also some degree of realization of the Four Noble Truths. So it all comes back to that. So then, what am I looking at here? Oh yeah, so this question, how do the three jewels protect us? So obviously not by material means, and not in the way that a creator God would protect us. So you see in many theistic religions that, especially monotheistic religions, but even multi-theistic religions, that the way to have protection from suffering is to please the creator God, right? Is to follow the commandments of that God and make offerings and make prayers in a way that they'll be happy with us. And then because they control what everything happens, then we'll be protected as long as our actions are pleasing to them. Now, I mean, of course, like I was saying, because in all those religions, what the things that the Creator God teaches, for the most part, are very wholesome, like don't kill, don't steal, don't lie. So just by following those things, then we bring more peace to our lives by abandoning harming others, right? Just by refraining from lying brings so much peace to one's life, right? So there's definitely benefit, but yeah, there's this whole different aspect of kind of pleasing Creator God, which is not present in Buddhism. So conversely, Buddhism teaches primarily a teaching. So how do the three jewels protect us? Primarily by teaching accurately the causes of happiness and suffering. So the Buddha, the Dharma, and Sangha primarily protect us by the Buddha as a teacher. And here there's the analogy that the Buddha himself taught in sutras. I'm not sure which sutra, but where the teacher, the Buddha, is like a doctor who looks at when we're sick, then we go to consult a doctor, and then they analyze us to see like what are the cause, what are the symptoms that we have that are disturbing us in body and mind. So what are the symptoms of the sickness that we find disturbing, and then what are the causes of that, right? And then once they can identify the causes, then they can prescribe a medicine, which is like the Dharma, is like the medicine that the doctor prescribes. And then the doctor can't be with us like day in and day out and explain how to use the medicine exactly. So they have nurse practitioners, right, to help them, right? So that's like the Sangha, like the nurse, to help us be able to understand how to engage with and how to make use and how to practice the Buddhist teachings and support us in doing so, right? So, so what is it that the Buddha teaches? Primarily karma, how karma, the law of cause and effect, is the main cause of the happiness and suffering we experience. So negative karmas give rise to suffering, and karma we create by having disturbing emotions, and at the root of disturbing emotions is the fundamental ignorance, which is the root of samsara. Then how to be free from those is by abandoning non-virtuous actions, engaging in virtuous actions, by instead of cultivating disturbing emotions, cultivating positive emotions in their place of mental focus, patience, and tolerance, generosity, loving kindness and compassion, and so forth. And then ultimately by generating wisdom, right? Wisdom, and a specific type of wisdom which is able to eliminate the root of samsara. And then it's up to us to practice. So it said that within the three jewels of refuge, the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, the main one is the Dharma, is the Dharma jewel, because it's by actually engaging with and practicing the Dharma is what directly protects our minds, and frees us from suffering. But it's totally, but no one can make us practice. It's totally up to us to practice, whether we want to or not, right? But actually taking refuge in Buddha, Dharma, Sangha is part of the practice, reinforcing our connection with them and reinforcing our commitment to actually practicing the Dharma. Therefore, the main refuge is the Dharma jewel. Okay, so we should stop here for lunch. Actually, let's read these quotations first. We have a couple minutes left. So there's this quotation from the King of Concentration Sutra. It's one of the Mahayana sutras. There's these two quotations. The one is one's own enemy and one's own protector. So this is just reaffirming that idea that ultimately, yes, the Buddha can teach us. Sometimes people ask, sometimes people new to Buddhism, especially, Westerners, because especially many of us who grew up in religious families and had kind of a bad experience with religion. Or, one big thing we see, and I mean, it's common to all the religious traditions, which is really disheartening, is hypocrisy. So much hypocrisy. People, say identifying as a Christian, but then doing totally unchristian things. Identifying as a Hindu or a Muslim or whatever, and then doing things that seem just basically just fundamentally immoral, right? Then how can you? Then what use is a religion if then people are just going to act totally immoral anyway, right? Then so it really puts people off from religion. So then sometimes people come when they're new to Buddhism, then they see Buddhist practitioners doing religious things like making prostrations, making offerings, reciting names with this kind of elaborate praises and so forth of the Buddha. Then people wonder, well, okay, you Buddhists, how do you relate to the Buddha? Do you relate to them the same way like Christians relate to God or Muslims relate to Allah or whatever? So it's an important question that comes. And the answer is like, no, we don't. I mean, outwardly, it can look very similar, right? And the way we pray to and make requests to the Buddha, it can definitely look like just very similar, like that we're praying to Buddha, making homage and prostrations as if the Buddha is an all-powerful being who can determine what happens to us, right? Who can stop anything that could harm us and can give us anything that we want ultimately, like an omnipotent God can, or supposedly can, right? But that's not the way actually that we relate to the Buddha. We shouldn't relate that way. I mean, probably some people do. Some Buddhists do, no question. But actually, that's not the correct way to relate to the Buddha, because actually the Buddha we don't see as an all-powerful being, right? The Buddha doesn't have the power to do everything. If the Buddha had infinite compassion and wanted to free all sentient beings from suffering and was all-powerful, then we would all be free from suffering. Then he should have used his power to free us all from suffering already. So clearly, the Buddha is not all-powerful. And you can even see in the story of the Buddha's life, I mean, the things like he became sick at some time, or he was he got a shrapnel of a stone in his foot at one time. So and I mean ultimately the real reason the Buddha is not all powerful is because actually karma is the most powerful force, right? Because ultimately what happens to a person is a result of their own actions, right? In the past, in this life or previous lives, and the Buddha doesn't have power over that. And as is seen in the Jataka tales, right, in the tales of the wise and the foolish, where the Buddha speaks about his own past lives and the past lives of his his mother, his father, his wife, his child, his main disciples, Shariputra, Moggallana, and he and other others who are connected with him. He speaks about how and explains how this is why we experience fortune and misfortune. It's because in one life we do this, in one life we steal and we kill, then in the future we experience, things being stolen from us and being killed. One life we practice generosity, and the next life we receive abundance. We have success in business or have abundance, and so forth, right? So actually karma is the most powerful force. And that's why, come back to this, one is one's own enemy and one is one's own protector, because it's only oneself who creates one's karma, right? No one else creates our karma. Only we can create karma, and thereby only ultimately we create the force which gives rise to our own fortune and misfortune in the future. So in that way, one's own. When we create negative karma, when we create negative karma, then we're our enemy. When we create virtuous karma, then we're our own protector, right?
Kishla, you brought up an interesting point about prostrations to the Buddha and how there are so many parallels to other religions. are you saying the prostrations to the Buddha are more for um, it, yeah, actually why?
It's a way of showing respect. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just like when you go to university
Yeah.
and there's a professor you have who clearly you realize they know a lot more than me and I can learn a
Yes.
lot from them.
Yes.
Then when they come in, you naturally are deferential. Open
Right.
the door, you stand up,
Right.
you don't speak over them.
Yes.
Whereas there could be another professor who you feel like they're just they don't know what they're talking about. They don't care about me. They're just doing this because, whatever, for a job. And then you naturally don't show much respect because you don't feel like they can benefit you much.
Right.
Right? So like that, it's like a recognition that the Buddha can benefit me a lot.
Mm.
And not so like can benefit me like I want something, but the Buddha has qualities that I admire and I aspire to be like
Got it.
that person. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
There is a sense of also the Buddha being like a guru, right? Like a teacher,
Mm-hmm.
an enlightened teacher that
Mm-hmm.
is, spent his whole life giving to others.
Mm-hmm.
The sense of that, that being a teacher and imparting is also something that is revered in many, many cultures, including Hinduism, for sure. Like there's a saying in Hinduism, Shri Guru Bhyo Namaha, which means like the guru is the one true. If you recognize someone as the guru, I think there's a whole module on
Guru devotion.
guru devotion,
Yeah, Buddhism.
right?
Yeah.
And that for sure is a big piece of why you're saying the prostration also occurs.
Yeah, it's respecting as a guru, as a teacher. Yeah.
Thank you.
But yeah, and maybe this is another distinction to make with the theistic religions is oftentimes, sometimes people think not only the Buddha is like omnipotent, but because in theistic religion, there's no story of like Allah or God in the past. They were ordinary being, and then they did this and this and this, and they became a god. They became God. There's an idea that from beginningless time they were perfect. And they're perfect now, and they'll always be perfect. But that because we from the beginning of our whatever existence we were imperfect. We'll never really be able to be perfect in the way God is, right? But the Buddha's the idea of the Buddha is completely different. Like every Buddha is believed to have been an ordinary person like us in the past, and then by practicing they became perfect, right? And thereby every ordinary being. I mean, this is part of what we were talking about yesterday about the view of what is the potential, who has the potential for enlightenment and who not. So in the view of the Buddhist schools, that every sentient being has a potential for enlightenment, just because of the nature of the mind. But it's a significant way of where the kind of refuge is going for is different, right? We're not going for refuge to a being who has always been perfect and is perfect now and will always be perfect because of that, but rather to a being who was imperfect like us and then figured out how to become perfect and thereby can teach us how to do the same thing. Right? It's a very different view now. Why don't we stop there for lunch? So we have, I don't know, hour and a half lunch break. We resume at 2. But let's dedicate briefly, by whatever virtuous energy we've created. Then, may we and all other sentient beings continually abide in virtuous actions of body, speech, and mind, which are causes for our happiness for ourselves and happiness and well-being for others. Yeah. Okay. See you at 2:00.